Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode in the Gerhard Center webinar series. Throughout this series, our goal is to provide valuable insights, share practical experiences, and engage local, regional, and international thought leaders and experts in discussions around pressing issues in development and social impact. If you follow our latest conversations, you might notice that our current focus has been centered on exploring creative and innovative approaches to financing social impact. For those who are joining us for the first time, my name is Kariman Shuair. I run the research division at the John D. Gerhard Center for Philanthropy, Civic Engagement, and Responsible Business, and I'll be your host for today's session. It's an absolute pleasure today to host Paul Reynolds, the founder and CEO of Save the Children Global Ventures, who will be leading today's discussion and sharing with us Save the Children experience in scaling innovative finance for social impact. Before we kick things off, I just would like to remind everyone to please stay muted during the conversation, just to minimize the background noise. However, of course, feel free to ask questions in the chat box or save them for the Q&A segment at the end of the session. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared as part of a new podcast series that we've just launched called Gerhard Talks. Season 1 of the series will be all about impact investing and will include this interview with Paul, as well as a great selection of other conversations with thought leaders like Acumen founder Jacqueline Novogratz, the Ford Foundation CEO Darren Walker, and sustainability expert John Ilkenton, and other great speakers. To listen to the podcast, all you need to do is just search for Gerhard Talks on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure you follow the show so you don't miss the episodes when they drop. Paul, thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to lead this conversation.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Paul. And before we begin, from a corporate lawyer to founder and CEO of Save the Children Global Venture, I'm sure many of us are curious to learn about your professional background.
Thanks, Kariman. I guess I've always been a believer that we're only going to solve the most significant social and environmental challenges of our time if we bring together the three sectors of society. So government, the private sector, and civil society. I think too often there are sort of silos between those three sectors of society. And yet, if we think about global poverty, if we think about climate change, if we think about waste management, a whole raft of different challenges, we actually need all three sectors to be working closely together. And in some ways, my career reflects that. I started off life as a corporate lawyer at Herbert Smith Freehills, doing mergers and acquisitions and private equity and other sorts of transactions like that. I went into a small local NGO in Melbourne where I was living at the time. I worked for World Vision for a period as Deputy CEO. I spent 4 years in Australia's capital, Canberra, working for 2 Australian Prime Ministers on domestic social policy before becoming the CEO of Save the Children in Australia and the Pacific. And then for the last 2 years, I've been the CEO of Save the Children Global Ventures, which is the new standalone entity for Save the Children to take innovative finance and new technologies to scale. So I guess, Kariman, I got here the long way around.
Oh, thank you so much, Paul. That's fantastic. Like all of us who work in development know of Save the Children, of course, but not all of us know much about its impact investing arm, Save the Children's Global Venture. So it would be fantastic to learn more about what spurred the need for large NGO as big as Save the Children to establish such funds.
Yes. So as you say, most of the listeners would be familiar with Save the Children. We're one of the world's largest non-government organisations focused on children's health, education and protection. In the Africa region, for example, we've got about 10,000 local staff. We're operating in almost every sub-Saharan African country. And then globally, of course, we're about 25,000 staff and 120 countries, I think we're now operating in. So we're large, and about 99.9% of our funding, Karaman, traditionally has come from philanthropy and grants. And as successful as Save the Children has been, when we look at the problems that we're trying to solve, we realise that the funding that we're tapping into is really woefully insufficient. So if we look at sort of the global numbers, and if listeners can bear with me on a few statistics just to sort of set the scene, the latest United Nations financing report estimates that to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a funding gap each year of about $4 trillion. To put that into context, global overseas development assistance, that is the total amount of money that is provided for development purposes by governments, is around 220 billion. And if we look at remittances, it's about another $650 billion. So as large as those numbers are, compared to that $4 trillion funding gap, we really have a significant challenge on our hands. So I think it's absolutely critical that organisations like Save the Children that are committed to the goals, in our case, of children's education and health, think really deeply about how we tap into alternative funding sources. So that's the challenge. I think on the positive side, there are actually a raft of new funding opportunities for organisations like Save the Children. This series is obviously on impact investing, and that's a really significant source of potential funding. But there are others, loan mechanisms, disaster risk financing, carbon markets potentially provide another significant and fast-growing source of funding for development purposes. And there are a range of others that we can talk to. So from a Save the Children perspective, looking at both the challenges and the opportunities that we face, we said we've got to really scale up our activities in innovative finance. But to do that successfully, we need a specific dedicated legal entity, in our case, Save the Children Global Ventures, and we need a team with perhaps non-traditional development skills and capabilities to be able to do that at scale. And so that's how we got where we are, Karaman. We have been experimenting for many years across Save the Children with innovative finance. Our first commercial impact investment fund was launched in Australia now over 4 years ago. But Save the Children Global Ventures was only created about 2 years ago to really take these activities to scale.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Okay, let me ask you this. Whenever we talk about impact investing, the first question that comes to mind is what is impact and how to measure it, okay? Because we know it differs, impact differs from a context to another and from organization to another. So let's talk a bit about what is impact for Save the Children and what are your main tools and mechanisms to measure such impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think your listeners will know that impact investing differs from traditional investing in the sense that it's investing with the specific intention to create positive social and environmental outcomes alongside the financial returns. And they do need to be measurable. And I think there's been rightly some criticism in the early days of impact investing around an insufficiently rigorous impact measurement and management systems associated with impact funds. At Save the Children, we wanted to go one step further than just having a general rigorous impact measurement and management system. And over the last couple of years, we've been developing what we call child lens investing. Many people on this call will be familiar with gender lens investing. It's been around for nearly 2 decades, and it's become really a quite important asset class in and of itself. But if we look globally, particularly in a continent like Africa, where about 50% of the population are young people or children, we really should be thinking about whether we can create a whole asset class around children and young people. And that's really what we've done. We've created a framework that looks at both the direct and indirect benefits of our investing activities, our investees. We look at that both before, as part of the due diligence process. We agree what measurements will be managed and monitored by the investees with our support. And we look even right through to the exit process, how we continue to make sure that we generate those positive impacts for children post Save the Children's ownership or involvement in the investment. So it's a sort of end-to-end process that we're involved with. And I would really perhaps classify our impact at 3 levels. There's the investee level. So what's the individual impact on children, both direct and indirect, of each of the individual investments that we're making? We also like to measure it at the portfolio. What's the impact that our investments collectively are having for children? And then we look at it systemically. And this, Karaman, I think is something that perhaps differs or is different from, say, the children as a fund manager compared to others. We really are interested in the systemic impact. As large as Save the Children is, even if we're extraordinarily successful in our investing activities, it's still going to be a relatively small amount. So what we want is to crowd in other non-government organisations like Save the Children and other impact investors into this child lens investing space. And it's only if we get that sort of systemic change that we're going to have the scale, I think, of impact on the problems that we care deeply about.
Could you please expand on the systemic impact, like with examples and from your experience project that you've worked on?
Yeah. So, the key systemic impact is that we've been having so far is this creation of a new asset class called child lens investing. We've been working with UNICEF and a range of other interested parties in trying to promote that. At the moment, Save the Children Global Ventures impact funds are the only ones that use this very deep systemic approach to child lens investing. But we are talking to a whole range of other asset managers, fund managers, about whether they would also like to adopt child lens investing or create funds associated with child lens investing. Save the Children Global Ventures products are only targeted at sophisticated or institutional investors. So there's a real opportunity for what we might call a retail asset manager, someone who has the appropriate regulatory licenses to offer investments to a much broader range of the population to take up a child lens investment product. And if we can do that, then I think I'll be having, it'll have been a very successful enterprise. But we're still away from that, and we're really still just promoting at the moment this notion of child lens investing and hoping that it'll take off.
Excellent. We noticed that you didn't start big right away. Like you piloted first fund. So of course there were doubts when you started, no matter how sure we are that the conventional means of finance are not sustainable, but getting into this means of impact investing, you had doubts. So I'm wondering what kind of challenges that you guys were thinking of and how did you navigate them?
Yes. So, Karaman, there's been a host of challenges, as you can possibly imagine. I would say we've had lots of internal skeptics within Save the Children about whether Save the Children should be involved, particularly in impact investing as a fund manager at all, and lots of skeptics externally, which is why we started with a pilot. And the pilot really wanted to test 3 investment hypotheses. The first one was, could we start to build a market for child lens investing as an asset class? Second of all, could we attract high quality pipeline, so investment opportunities that were aligned with Save the Children's mission? And thirdly, post-investment, could we add significant value to those investments that would accelerate both impact for children as well as generate strong financial returns. So our first impact investment fund that we launched 4 years ago was only a small pilot, about $7.5 million in total capital. We've fully deployed that capital now into about 11 investments. And we've been really pleased with the progress, both the impact progress, but also the financial returns, or the trajectory for the financial returns, I should say. It's a 10-year closed fund, so one always needs to be very cautious, given that most of the returns will happen towards the end of the fund once you start to exit investments. But the trajectory so far has been strong, and that's given us enough confidence to launch a second fund, an Asia-focused fund that we're currently fundraising for. And we're planning on soon launching a third fund, an Africa debt fund called the Generation Empowerment Fund. Happy to talk more about both of those products and the process for going there. But we did spend a lot of time talking to potential investors about what their parameters were. And I think this is one of the challenges that many of us, perhaps that come from the development side, have. We're all quite convinced, obviously, about the potential for this new capital to have impact. But there has to be a real matchmaking process. We have to actually develop products that meet the risk, the return and impact goals of different classes of investors. And so we did spend quite a significant amount of time talking to investors in both Asia, in Africa, the Middle East, in Europe, and a range of places, both private investors as well as development finance institutions, to really understand what their parameters were from an investment perspective. So that's also a really significant and important part of the process.
And what's the main differences between the first fund and the second fund, before we go and talk about the African one?
Yeah, so there are lots of different ways to approach becoming an impact investor and to have different types of funds. We launched the first one as a equity fund. So that is where we're investing in what are called late seed or Series A investments. So these are startups, generally health and education startups, that have started to prove a business model and are ready to scale. That's sort of the stage of investment that we've been looking at. The first fund was a global fund, so we weren't particularly restricted by geography, and we've tried to get a really good mix of investments across the world. The second fund, however, based on investor feedback, is much more targeted geographically. So it's using a similar sort of strategy. That is, it's an equity-focused fund, late seed, Series A type investments. But in this second case, it's focused on Asia. We got to that point based on feedback from potential investors in both Australia, in Hong Kong, Singapore, and the region. For our third fund, the Africa Debt Fund, we were originally thinking that we would adopt a similar strategy in Africa. But as we were talking to investors, potential investors, we got some very clear feedback that they were perhaps more concerned around an equity strategy focused on sub-Saharan Africa. Not surprisingly, capital markets are somewhat thinner in Africa, and that they were much more comfortable with a debt strategy. So based on the feedback that we got from investors, we started looking at how we would deploy a debt strategy in Africa. And we started talking to financial institutions, other organisations that were involved in the education and health space, and we certainly found a large untapped market there. And so our third fund, the Africa Debt Fund, called the Generation Empowerment Fund, will be focused on 6 priority sub-Saharan African countries. It will deploy the capital primarily through financial institutions, so about 60 to 70% of the funds that we're looking to raise will be deployed through financial institutions in Africa who agree to on-lend to education and health facilities to help expand their activities in those countries. The other, say 30%, will be direct investments into larger, more established organisations, again, education, health, perhaps some nutrition, that are looking for debt financing. And that whole fund has a really strong climate overlay as well. So when we're, for example, financing perhaps new classrooms in schools, we'll be looking to make sure that, for example, the flooring is flood resistant, that there's appropriate insulation being built into the schooling, that perhaps they're also able to finance solar panels and water tanks and other sorts of things as part of the debt that we're providing to that education facility via the financial institution. So that's the sort of three different approaches that we have. We also have a fourth fund, Karaman, called the Children's Multiplier Fund, which is a venture philanthropy fund. So the first real distinction is between how you raise the capital, whether it's donation-based, which is the venture philanthropy fund. And if you've had Acumen on the show before, they might have talked about their venture philanthropy approach. They were really a pioneer in this space, and we're building off their approach. Or whether you have a more commercial impact investment fund, which is these three funds that I've just outlined. And the overall goal from a Save the Children Global Ventures perspective is to be able to have a spectrum of capital that has different risk, return and impact profiles, so that when we find a problem, we can bring the right sort of capital to the table. And we've been speaking obviously about innovative finance, Karaman, but of course, in the sort of mainstream Save the Children, we've got our nearly $3 billion of philanthropy and grants as well. And you know, there are lots of problems that only grants and philanthropy can solve. You know, when we have a really significant humanitarian crisis in the Middle East or in sub-Saharan Africa, the most important early financing will come through our grants and philanthropy. And then it's a question around, can we start to move across to these more innovative finance methods to bring in larger forms of capital.
Excellent. So because I was just curious why, like, the African fund that you guys opt to make it like a debt fund, not an equity fund. So I think you clarified this, saying that it came like from the investors, which like reflects that there could be like some sort of a higher risk. So I want to ask you, do you think that if this fund showed success, do you expect that we might have like something of an equity fund later on? Is this something on your plan?
It's certainly possible. In the meantime, what we're doing is using our venture philanthropy fund, the Children's Multiplier Fund that I just mentioned, that can make equity investments, and we're actually looking at a range of equity. Yes? Can you hear me, Karaman?
Hello?
Hello, you're back, I think.
No, okay. I'm sorry. So it was my
Right. Sorry. So I was saying, Karaman, we can use our venture philanthropy fund, the Children's Multiplier Fund, for equity investments in Africa, and we're doing that at the moment. We've got a number of potential investees that we're looking at, and because that's, say, the Children Global Ventures' own balance sheet, we can, if you like, take on a higher level of risk, and we can also be an owner for a longer period of time. The commercial funds that we've been talking about are what are called 10-year closed funds. That is, we take the capital from investors, we deploy the capital, we manage the investments, and then as we're getting towards the last couple of years of the 10-year period, we then need to realise those assets. With the Children's Multiplier Fund, we've got a lot more flexibility. We can hang on to those assets or invest in those assets for a lot longer period of time, if that's what's required. So again, I think the challenge for organisations like Save the Children is to make sure that they have what I would call more tools in the toolbox. Traditionally, we've really just had grants and philanthropy. What we're now doing at Save the Children is saying we've got to have grants and philanthropy. They remain very, very important, but we want to have the venture philanthropy product. We want to have the commercial funds. We're also using these loan mechanisms. We're using carbon markets and a range of these different types of tools. And we're able to therefore select the right tool for the problem that we're wanting to solve. And I think that's the sort of key message I would encourage people to take from this webinar and podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. Like, many investors reported that they have problems with the project pipeline. Do you think that the fact that you are an NGO originally that is more aware of community needs and dynamics give you some sort of advantage over investment firms that have only got recently into the impact investing space? And this could be a reason why your investors don't face this challenge?
Yes, well, we've certainly been overwhelmed with the amount of pipeline. We're probably seeing 20 to 30 investment opportunities every month, which is far more than obviously we can invest in. And I think it's because, partly because we do have that very large global network. One of our first investments that we made into a health tech business, the country director in Bangladesh was actually piloting with this company, and contacted me and said, Paul, we're really excited about the outcomes from the pilot with this company. We hear that they're looking for investment. Can I provide an introduction? And we certainly do get some referrals from a very significant global footprint. But actually, most of the referrals now come directly to Save the Children Global Ventures as people have started to be aware that we're an impact investor in the health and education space. And I think many of the investees are realising that there is something unique about a large international NGO as a fund manager, this extraordinary platform that we have, the 25,000 people, the 120 countries, the deep technical knowledge and capacity around health and education. Other fund managers, pure fund managers, don't have that. So if we can leverage that platform to generate more impact and better financial returns, it really does position us as quite a unique, albeit still niche, fund manager in this impact investing space.
Thank you, Paul. You referred first about the importance of getting governments to work with civil society and private sector, and that's like there is no way out of this. We hear now about the potentials of using blended finance, especially in our region, as a tool to crowd funds for development projects. Do you work with this tool? If yes, can you just talk a bit about it?
Yeah, so one of our first deals as Save the Children Global Ventures was a blended finance transaction in South Africa and Rwanda, where we brought together a range of different forms of capital. We had a US aid capital guarantee. We provided actually some funding out of our multiplier fund, that highly catalytic and more risk-taking capital that we have ourselves. And then we crowded in some private sector capital with, at a sort of concessionary rate. But we made sure that we put in place currency protection, credit protections, et cetera, that would mean that although it was low return, it was still going to be, or that it would be relatively low risk. And that was financing early childhood development centres in those two countries. So that was our sort of first blended finance transaction. Since then, we've been involved with about $100 million worth of other blended finance transactions just in our first couple of years. And I think this really points, Karaman, to the potential market and the potential opportunity for organisations like NGOs to build up a capacity around blended finance. I actually don't think it's an option anymore. It's an absolute requirement that you have the skills and capabilities in-house that allow you to combine your traditional grants and philanthropy with this private sector sources of capital, which is ultimately what blended finance is all about. So that's a core capability of Save the Children Global Ventures that we provide to the rest of Save the Children.
Fantastic. Okay, for a new and innovative organization like yours, I assume a need for new and innovative talents has to emerge. Like, What kind of talents or caliber do your organization need?
Yes, well, we have obviously very deep expertise in health and education and child protection, those sorts of areas, and we certainly draw on them as part of any due diligence process. So if we're looking at making an investment into a education provider, for example, in Asia, I'll talk to our global education team. I'll talk to education experts at Save the Children in country, might be Indonesia or Philippines or wherever it might be. And so that's the sort of traditional capability that we can draw on. What we needed to do was to complement that with the ability to do the sort of financial analysis that usually exists in the investment world and marry those two pieces together. And I think that's the challenge. We talked earlier, Karaman, about some of the challenges associated with this. They're two often quite different cultures. And it is not necessarily easy to bring those two cultures together and to put them, to make them productive. It's why we created Save the Children Global Ventures as a separate legal entity, still part of the Save the Children family. But we wanted to give us, I guess, the best of both worlds. We wanted to be part of the Save the Children family, to be able to leverage the strengths of the platform. But we also wanted to be able to create a more agile, entrepreneurial and in some ways risk-taking culture that would be perhaps more effective from a blended finance or impact investing perspective. Now, it's still early days, Karaman. It's certainly not easy, and I wouldn't say that we've solved all of these problems yet, but we're really acutely aware that we have to find this intermediate culture at Global Ventures that marries these two, is able to essentially speak both to the development world as well as to the investment world.
And I think universities also should respond to this emerging need now in the market. The fact that some business schools operate in silos and just produce pure financiers with little exposure to the social, and the same thing with humanitarian and social focus schools, bridging the gap between this and that. An organization like yours highlight the need for bridging this gap. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to endorse that, Karaman. I think many of our MBA type courses and some of the others are still too siloed, and increasingly we're seeing the two worlds of finance and social change or social impact needing to come together. And so I think there is a huge opportunity for universities to rethink some of their MBA courses and to help us train up the next generation of talent that more and more of us are going to need. So I think that's one space. The other area that we're doing a lot of partnering with academic institutions on is in the early stage innovation. Academia can be a great source of some of the health tech and ed tech breakthroughs that eventually might go out into the market. And so we've formed relationships with a number of incubators and accelerators, social incubators and accelerators based in universities around the world that are doing work aligned with Save the Children's mission. And we do see them as critical partners in our endeavours.
Excellent. So you work with university incubators?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, if you can give us examples of projects that were housed in universities and how you engage with the university around it.
Yeah, so recently we engaged with a team based at a university who had been working on using AI to better diagnose respiratory issues in children. Obviously, things like pneumonia, COVID even, other respiratory challenges can be really significant causes of deaths in children. And so if we can get much better frontline health diagnosis in a really cheap medical tool, then that could be a major breakthrough. And this team based out of a university have been doing a lot of work on this AI for some years. And it's super exciting. They have now got some evidence that suggests that the diagnosis using this AI tool is now more accurate than many European doctors, for example,
Wow.
in diagnosing respiratory illnesses in children. So it's a great example of the potential here for health tech to really bridge the global health divide between wealthy countries and low-income countries, and to make sure that everyone has access to quality healthcare. Now, working with them early on, they're not yet ready, it's not yet ready for us to make an investment in them. They're probably still too early, but it really helps for us to be working with that team 12, 18 months ahead of when they're ready to do their first fundraising and start to be, spin out of a university to help set that up in the right sort of way. So we're often looking for those sorts of, early breakthroughs. We'll maintain a relationship over that 12 or 18 month period, maybe even longer, before our first investment takes off.
Excellent. Okay, I want also to ask you, I don't want to dominate the conversation, so please, the audience, if you have a question, we will open the floor for question and answer. Just raise your hand so that I make sure I don't take much time, my question. But I'm really curious about the questions related to localization, localizing finance and impact, especially that you're dealing your audience or children. And their needs is different across the globe. You work globally. So I'm just curious, how do you approach the issues, sensitive issues related to localization?
You're absolutely right. I think there's a real opportunity to use these innovative finance tools to further our localization goals. The ability to put together an impact fund requires quite a lot of investment upfront. It's quite a difficult process. It's probably not something that most local NGOs are going to be able to do. So I do see, say, the children and other large NGOs having a responsibility to invest in establishing these sorts of mechanisms, and then using the capital to allow local organisations to be able to expand. So lots of the investees that we're looking at, for example, through the Multiplier Fund, are all local entrepreneurs based in Africa who understand their context intimately and have developed solutions that are perfectly well suited. So we've invested, for example, in Zaraki, which is a Kenyan edtech business, a great local Nairobi-based team of entrepreneurs. They are growing rapidly in Kenya and now into other markets. And we see our ability to provide global capital to an investment, and invest into a local team in Nairobi as part of our localization agenda for Save the Children.
Excellent. We got a question. Do you offer a range of expectations to returns on investment? Like, if I'm an investor, do I have the option to choose from concessionary to risk-adjusted returns?
We do see investors with a very broad range of different return profiles. So our commercial impact funds, the equity ones, of course, provide or should provide the best returns. We're targeting, double-digit returns for our funds 1 and 2. For the Africa Debt Fund, because it's debt, we have slightly lower returns than the equity funds. And we've actually created what's called a capital stack. So we have an equity layer that actually Save the Children has invested some of its own balance sheet into. We expect to generate a return around the sort of 8 to 10% for that equity layer. We have a junior debt level that will be more like the sort of 6 to 8% return, and then a senior debt level. So that's the least risky layer of capital for the Generation Empowerment Fund, and that will be more like the 5 to 6% return. So again, we're able to talk to an investor around what their return requirements are, what their risk appetite is, and then identify the best product that meets their goals.
Also, like, for your organization to scale and grow, you yourself need like financial stability. So if you can just talk a little bit about your own business model, how do you maintain your financial stability?
So Save the Children provided an initial grant to Save the Children Global Ventures, and that's part of Save the Children's, I guess, commitment to building up what we call a second engine at Save the Children. So if our first engine is philanthropy and grants, our second engine is innovative finance. And Save the Children realised that it needed to provide some medium-term support to global ventures to get it established. So we're about halfway through that period of committed support from the broader Save the Children family. And then we're using fees associated with our impact funds, some cost recovery, and some consulting income to be able to complement. And over time, that fee income will make up a broader proportion of the income coming into global ventures. So that's essentially how we're managing our own business model.
Thank you, Paul. Please, for the audience, if you have a question, just feel free to raise your virtual hand and I can call you to ask, to address your question directly to Paul. Abbas, go ahead. Barzigar.
Yes, thank you, Kariman. My question is around actual numbers. I'm trying to get a sense of the potential for scale and impact here. So would it be possible, Paul, and thank you for your presentation, would it be possible for you to just provide some numbers around a case or two, whether it's equity or debt, on the size of the investment, the size of the overall project, potential for beneficiaries, and the health tech and edutech spaces are very interesting, but just curious about what those actual numbers look like.
Yeah, thank you, Abbas. It's a really good question. So let me sort of talk first of all around the sort of investment side. Our first fund was making relatively modest size investments, about an average of 500,000 US per investment, and that really came from the overall relatively small size of the fund. Fund 3, where we'll be targeting between $50 and $75 million of total capital, it will make investments of closer to $3 to $5 million per investment. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of scale there. In terms of the other side, the impact side, if we think about some of the health tech investments that we're making, particularly those health tech investments that are potentially suited to frontline health workers, there is about 15 million frontline health workers globally. And that represents a fairly significant investment potential for the investees. So imagine we've got a great product that could potentially make the frontline health workers in villages in Asia and Africa and other places far more effective, and we've made 2 of these sorts of investments to date. That 15 million frontline health worker population, if we can offer them, if we use a sort of software as a service type model, can actually be quite a lucrative financial return for us as well, if we can crack that market. So we do see, we are looking for investees, certainly on the equity side, where we can really scale up using, say, the Children's Platform, really scale up to have a really significant impact on millions of children's lives, not just, thousands.
No, that's great, Paul. Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. What sectors do you find to be the most promising for this kind of investment?
Well, from a Save the Children perspective, we're absolutely focused on children's education, health and protection. And I'm particularly excited about the opportunities in health. I mean, with some of the technology breakthroughs that we're seeing, the ability to provide really low cost or create low cost devices that can provide really high quality care, I do think there is an opportunity to really bridge the sort of quality health divide over the sort of coming decade or two, and make good financial returns for our investors at the same time. So that's perhaps what really excites me and gets me out of bed in the morning.
That's
Thank you.
great. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Abbas. Thank you, Paul. We have a question from Frank Aswani. Please, Frank, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, Paul. How are you? Thank you for your presentation. I'm Frank Aswani. I'm the CEO at AVPA. So this is exciting to see more traditional kind of nonprofits coming to the impact space. I totally agree with you. Without private capital, we'll not meet the SDGs. So this is great to see. So a couple of things, two questions for me. One, because of a lot of what we don't know, do you have some risk capital that is you're using to experiment and test some of these innovative financing mechanisms? Is that your multiplier fund? So you can run small pilots to do so. And Africa is perfectly the right place to be doing this just because of the diverse nature of challenges and impact opportunities we have. And in many ways, whatever innovation works in Africa is globally scalable. I think so. It's perfect to look at Africa as a sandbox for impact. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, you also spoke about the need for systemic change. And I'd be quite keen to look at, for your fund, the Generation Empowerment Fund, what is your vision about the systemic change you think this could add to Africa? And of particular interest, I'm trying to see how you're leveraging carbon credits in your models.
Yeah, thanks, Frank, and great to see you again. And congratulations on the fantastic work that you're doing in Africa. So really three different questions there. You're absolutely right. Our Children's Multiplier Fund is the most catalytic, it's the most flexible capital, and that's why we were really keen to make sure that alongside the commercial impact funds, we had this, if you like, what I would call a halfway house. It's not philanthropy, it's not grants. We've got to actually get we've got to get our capital back and a very modest return for the Children's Multiplier Fund, but because it's our own balance sheet, we can be much more catalytic and risk-taking. And in fact, most of the capital that we're deploying from the Children's Multiplier Fund is actually going into Africa rather than Asia and other parts of the world. So, you know, you're absolutely right there. In terms of systemic change from the Generation Empowerment Fund, there are absolutely some financial institutions in Africa that are already lending to the education and health sectors. But when we look at the capital needs in Africa in education and health over the coming decades, they are trillions and trillions of dollars. So what I'm hoping that our Generation Empowerment Fund will do will be another example to investors that this is actually an investment class in Africa that is providing a reasonable risk return and therefore crowding a lot more capital than certainly what Save the Children can provide. I mean, you and I both know that it's only if we can actually attract hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars more money into the health and education sectors in Africa that we're going to make sure that we can give every child in Africa a quality basic education, if we can actually make sure that children get the sort of healthcare that they deserve. And so I am very hopeful that this Generation Empowerment Fund will be another example, and we're not the only one doing this. There are Opportunity International, there's Acumen, there are other players there. I did see Acumen are getting close to, I understand, a first close on their Hardest to Reach fund, which is about a $250 million fund. We talked a little bit earlier, a moment ago, about sort of scale and opportunities here. Water Equity have just last week, I think, announced $100 million close of their water equity funds. So there are starting to be the sort of size of scale of funds that will have an impact, but we need to keep growing those. We need to show examples like the Generation Empowerment Fund to investors that there is a real market in Africa and other places for these sorts of innovative finance mechanisms. And then your third question around carbon markets. I think this is a super exciting opportunity. Listeners will know that we're only going to achieve our climate change goals if nature-based solutions to climate change are a significant portion of our solutions. And most of the stewards of natural assets in places like Asia and Africa, and indeed in Australia, where I'm originally from, are actually communities and Indigenous groups. And so the question is, how do we help those community groups, Indigenous groups, better manage the natural asset that they have and get the benefit of it? I mean, what we don't want to see here is another situation where the community gets a very small 5, 6, 7% of the total amount raised. What we want to see is a much fairer proportion of the value created by their stewardship of a natural resource flowing back to that community that is having not just environmental outcomes, but also health and educational or whatever it might be. So Save the Children Global Ventures is working across the Save the Children platform at the moment. We've identified about a dozen high-profile, highly scalable communities where we think a voluntary carbon market project could generate really strong, ongoing capital into that community. So yeah, we're very excited about it.
Thanks, Paul. I'd be happy to take an offline conversation. We're just about to launch a $200 million catalytic pool fund to crowd in capital, private capital, especially domestic private capital, into healthcare, education, agriculture, and kind of the clean energy space. So we'll take this offline. Happy to chat about it. We're launching it actually in New York next week at UNGA, and then in Africa during our conference in November. So happy to have a conversation.
Marvelous. Look forward to it. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you so much, Frank, and thank you, Paul, for your response. Just if we have any other question from the audience. Okay, Paul, we would like to get your insight in where you think the field of innovative finance for social impact will be in, let's say, 10 or 20 years. Do you see other major NGOs moving in a similar direction? Do you think there is a sustainable investor appetite for this?
So I think that the trends are increasingly clear, Karaman. So first of all, that growing gap that we started this webinar with, that is not slowing down. If anything, it's actually increasing with climate change, a lot of the conflicts that we're seeing right around the world. So I think we can be confident that the need for innovative finance will continue to grow. We're also seeing either flat or declining official development assistance. So governments around the world are increasingly under fiscal constraints and are cutting back on that official development assistance. So that won't be a source. We have to find these alternative sources of income. On the other side, on the opportunity side, we are seeing growth in what are called donor advised funds. So for example, in the US, there are now about $280 billion of capital managed by donor advised funds. And most of those donor advised funds are investing in, traditional bonds and stocks and only giving away about 5% of their capital each year. That's a huge untapped opportunity if we can convince those donor advised funds to put 10 or 20% of their endowment into impact investing. And similarly, family offices, and we've seen really significant growth in development finance institutions. At the same time as overseas development assistance has been flat, we've seen really significant growth in governments increasing the amount of capital that they are allocating to development finance institutions. So I see lots of opportunities. Whether or not NGOs like Save the Children will take advantage of those, I think is still an open question. It does require change. It requires boards and trustees who are aware of those strategic changes that I'm talking about and are willing to support their management teams in making the necessary changes to processes and systems, skills, capabilities, all of those sorts of things to be able to take advantage of these new innovative finance mechanisms. And that is a huge challenge. I mean, essentially, the way I talk about it inside Save the Children is that this is a major business transformation for Save the Children. It can't just be a Save the Children Global Ventures issue. It's got to be all parts of Save the Children, skilling up, growing its capacity, growing its capability to be able to use mechanisms like blended finance, loan mechanisms, impact investing, etc. So I think the real challenge for other NGOs is whether they are willing to do that sort of major business transformation. And I would say come into this new world where rather than just one or two tools in the toolbox, we're giving our teams, our country directors, our philanthropy and corporate partnership teams, a whole range of tools in their toolbox to attract different types of capital. That's the challenge before us. And Kariman, maybe we'll have to get together in 4 or 5 years' time and work out how far the sector has come.
Thank you, Paul. If you don't mind the final question, I know that we're running out of time, so if you don't mind, we take another question. Abbas, please.
Excuse me for taking up more time, but Paul, the note about donor advised funds, I work with donor advised fund service providers across the United States through community foundations, and they're always looking for interesting investment options. Are there sort of easy entry opportunities for donor advised fund holders, or for, let's say, a community foundation that wanted to pull some donor advised funds together and partner with, let's say, Save the Children? Or do you think that those sort of entry points still need to be developed?
I think, Abbas, that they're being developed. I would say one of the challenges that we've seen is that the development of products, so how we productize these opportunities, has been slower than we would like. And that's really where Global Ventures has been focused. Can we understand what, for example, the trustees of these donor advised funds are looking for from an impact risk return type profile? And can we develop products that meet their goals? Too often I see products being launched by an organisation that they haven't done enough sort of investor research to understand what the constraints are. And I think that is part of the reason why we've seen so many potential impact investors saying that they can't find the pipeline that they're looking for. And of course, the really big prize here, Abbas, is pension funds. Talking about the sort of different pools of capital that are available, I think it's estimated that globally there's about $55 trillion of funds that are sitting in pension funds. So if we can create products that can attract just 10% of the pension fund capital and give them the risk return and impact profiles that they're after, we've just solved the SDG funding gap. Now, it's obviously not going to be as easy as all that, but it's not like we've got to get 100%. It's just 10%, and we've met that challenge. That shouldn't be beyond the wit of those of us that care globally about these sorts of challenges. So I think that's what we've got to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Abbas. Frank, please.
Sorry, I'm sorry if I'm hogging time, but this is an exciting topic for me. So Paul, I think the other thing is also, how do we think about scaling some of these initiatives and building, and especially when you come to Africa? So one of the barriers we found is just a lack of impact competent human capital at a critical mass. And part of the reason is just there isn't enough institutions. I think the whole of continent of Africa has one institution of learning with a sustainable finance program. So we've got to figure out how do we get some of these initiatives institutionalized so we can produce the competent human capital at the required scale, and also help NGOs make the transition from seeing themselves as just grant receivers to actually sustainable runners of organizations that can generate some revenue of their own, and convince them that profit in impact is not a bad thing, so long as it's not exploitative. So just, I think Save the Children will be at an interesting space as leaders in this childless investing to see how you can contribute to the human capital question in this space.
I think you're absolutely right, Frank. And this goes back to our earlier conversation about the role of academic institutions here too. I think they need to rethink a lot of their courses in business that are often, very finance orientated and not sufficiently impact, because, organisations like Save the Children need more human capability that is able to bridge the divide between impact and finance. Investors are going to need it, family offices, advisors to donor advised funds. I mean, there's going to be a really big demand for people that have this sort of capability in different regions. And Africa is obviously a really significant and important one. So I think that's a great way, Kariman, to end the webinar on a call out to African-based academic institutions to help us skill the next generation of impact investors that allow us to really scale the potential here and solve some of these education and health challenges that we care so deeply about.
Thank you so much, Paul. We're just right on time. Thank you so much. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it and we've learned a lot. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you all of you, like the audience and Frank and Abbas. Thanks everyone. And enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Karim.
Thank you.